Theta here at CSUSB. Um, I'd like to welcome today our guest today, Dr. Robert Chao Romero. Dr. Romero is an associate professor in the departments of Chicana/Chicano Studies and Central American Studies and Asian American Studies at UCLA. He received his PhD from UCLA in Latin American Studies and his Juris Doctor from UC Berkeley, and is also an attorney. He is the author of Brown Church: 5 Centuries of Latina/Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity, The Chinese in Mexico, 1882 to 1940, Jesus for Revolutionaries: An Introduction to Race, Social Justice, and Christianity, and Mixed Race Student Politics. The Chinese in Mexico book received the Latina/Latino book award from the Latin American Studies Association, and Brown Church was written with the support of the Louisville Institute Sabbatical Grant for Researchers. Dr. Romero is also an ordained minister and a faith-rooted community organizer. Our topic for today is Brown Church: 5 Centuries of Latina/Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity. Please welcome our guest today, Dr. Robert Chao Romero. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks so much, Nathan. It's been a real pleasure to work with you. Thank you for all the hard work you put in preparing this talk. I'm really honored to work with you and Professor Murray, Professor Tejeda, and others that I have yet the good pleasure of meeting. I'll just start with a little bit about myself. I never would, if you would have asked me 20 years ago, would I have written this book or any book, I would have been like, no, that's not my plan. My background, so I was born in Boyle Heights, raised in Hacienda Heights. My dad is an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico. My mom is an immigrant from China, from Hubei in central China. And when I went off to college, I thought I'm just gonna make a lot of money, drive a Ferrari, be rich and famous, and went off to law school with that same kind of mind frame. And then I kind of had like a deep sort of Augustinian experience in law school that kind of changed everything for me. And after that, I felt a calling to become a professor and to use the platform as professor to do what I do today, to discuss issues of race in the United States. So the first part of my academic kind of career was studying the Chinese in Mexico, which I loved. It was great. But to share a little bit more background, as I was getting tenure at UCLA, I was doing a lot of work with my wife, Erica, where we would train students in issues of justice and race from a faith-rooted perspective. And that's where we did community organizing work, and we did mentorship and all that kind of stuff. We took students to protests and we taught them how to organize, and we did all kinds of manners of things like that. I married students, I baptized students, like so many things, this big adventure. After I got tenure, I was listening to a Lauryn Hill song, and Lauryn Hill is it's kind of back in the day, but maybe some of you might know Lauryn Hill. And in her MTV album, she talks about kind of getting tired of leaving like 2/3 of herself outside of the door. And she wanted to just kind of be authentic to herself in her music. And then in a similar way, I said, well, I've got tenure now, got my whole career ahead of me. I would love it if I could bring together sort of the work I was doing in the community with faith-rooted community organizing and pastoral work with the academic work that I was doing at UCLA. And so I was kind of like with fear and trepidation, I talked to my chair and I said, got this idea, what do you think? And he's like, go for it. That kind of led me on this path of Brown Church to the present day. I'm gonna share my slides so we can track together. Move this over here. Use slideshow. That's the cover of the book that just came out about five months ago, The Brown Church. I'd like to start off with the story, with a critical race theory counter narrative. This is based upon a student that I met a few years ago. I'm calling her Rosa. So Rosa was excited about attending her first college lecture. She was the first of her family to go to college. Her strong grade point average earned her a full ride to a good university. She grew up in the local church. Her mom and dad were deacons and had brought her up to be a person of faith. They told many stories of how God had taken care of them when they made the dangerous journey to the United States across the Sonoran Desert. Her dad worked 2 jobs, as a short order cook during the week and a gardener during the weekend. He also collected cardboard to raise extra money for the family. Her mom was a nanny to a rich family in San Marino and also managed their family of 4 kids. Church provided one of the few spaces of social respect for Rosa's parents. They had dignidad when they walked into church and were addressed as deacons and hermano and hermana Ramos. Her first class was a Chicano history class, and her professor began his lecture by saying, "Christianity is the white man's religion." The professor went on to detail how the Spaniards used Christianity to colonize the Aztecs and the millions of indigenous people of the Americas. Rosa also learned about how the Bible was used to justify ethnic genocide, murder, and the oppression of women. Rosa left class devastated. She didn't know what to do. Who was right about Christianity? Was it her working class immigrant parents, or was it her professor who had his PhD from Harvard and had written many famous books over the past 20 years? Or was the truth perhaps somewhere in between? When I met Rosa several years ago at a community immigration event in Pico Union, I heard her story, and she was actually going to see a psychiatrist because of the deep depression and loss that she was feeling as a result. I've met many Rosas over the years, and perhaps have myself also been in the same situation where we feel like we're stuck in between the worlds of activism and faith. Activism and faith. You could call it the spiritual activist borderlands. On the one hand, we come to the university and we learn about important issues of structural injustice, systemic injustice in education and historically and in many other settings. But when oftentimes we go back to our communities of faith and we try to make the connection to faith, we're told, oh, that's not really Christianity, or that is just Marxism, or that doesn't have to do with the real gospel of Jesus. On the other hand, oftentimes when we go to the world of activism, we're told, oh, you can't be a Christian and care about, or a person of faith and care about these issues of justice and race, because Christianity is simply the colonizer's religion. So many people, I think millions of people, are kind of stuck in between in this borderland space. And this borderland space, as much as I love my discipline of Chicano Studies, is also reflected there. And it's also reflected in a research gap on religion and the Latino community. It's very much prevalent. Mario Garcia, who is a pioneering Chicano historian at UC Santa Barbara, and a friend of mine, he wrote, despite the fact that the vast majority of US Latinos claim to be religious or spiritual, little has been written on Mexican-American/Chicano religions from a multidisciplinary perspective. If you step back into some other disciplines that look at the study of religion, such as religious studies or Latinx theology, liberation theology, these disciplines have very little interaction with Chicano studies and with each other. So it's a very interesting situation. And so again, Chicano studies is also kind of very much a place of this this borderlands experience with respect to religion and justice. My colleagues at UCLA are very much sympathetic to kind of this argument or this gap, and I'm working with them, for example, to produce a whole dossier in the Aslan Journal of Chicano Studies about religion and activism soon. So I think there's an opening space now, I think, in the field to have more of these conversations. I present my book, Brown Church and the Framework, as a puente, or a bridge between Chicanx Studies, Latinx Studies, theology, and religious studies. And I should say, I do this all kind of as an outsider to most of these fields. Of course, I'm not an outsider to Chicano Studies, Chicanx Studies, but I'm not, even though I'm a pastor, I'm not like a theologian. I'm not formally trained in theology. I'm not also formally trained in religious studies. So I'm kind of doing it as an outsider, and that's been a very interesting experience that, be glad to talk about. But I framed this notion of brown church in the following way, that the brown church is a prophetic ecclesial community of Latinas and Latinos, both Catholic and Protestant, that has contested racial and social injustice in Latin America and the United States for the past 500 years. As such, brown church is a multivalent category encompassing ethnic, historical, theological, spiritual, and socio-political dimensions. In every instance of racial and social injustice in Latin America and the United States over the centuries, the brown church has arisen to challenge the religious, socio-economic, and political status quo. Collectively, the brown church has challenged such great evils as the Spanish conquest and Spanish colonialism, the Sistema de Castas, manifest destiny and US settler colonialism in the Southwest, American dictatorships in Latin America, US imperialism in Central America, the oppression of farm workers, and the current exploitation and marginalization of undocumented immigrants. The brown church has been this social figure in all these movements. And unfortunately, the brown church, however, is very little discussed in most of the academic literature. There are many examples over the centuries. In the corner here, you have Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Dominican friar who challenged the conquest of Latin America. I'm just going to give a quick overview here and then come back to some examples. Cesar Chavez in the middle, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in the corner there, considered the first feminist, the martyred Archbishop San Oscar Romero, and many others, which we will discuss. I also present this concept of brown theology as a way of bringing together the theological social justice tradition of Latinas and Latinos. So there's a 500-year tradition of Latino social justice theological reflection, 500 years. And depending upon the religious circles where you may or may not swim in, justice is sort of a trendy topic now, right, to talk about. Let's talk about justice in the Bible. And that's great. I'm glad that that conversation is happening. But as the brown church, we've been doing it for 500 years, for 500 years. And I argue that brown theology embodies 5 centuries of Latino spiritual capital and community cultural wealth to draw from critical race theory. And indeed, brown theology is an important knowledge system. Right? A note on brown. When I'm talking about brown as a symbol of, first, the cultural, biological mestizaje or mixture in Latin America. So as Latinos, we come in all shades, right? I mean, we are indigenous Latinos, we are mestizo Latinos, we are Afro Latinos, we are Asian Latinos like myself, Jewish Latinos, Armenian. We're like everything, right? Like, and I think that mixture that we have in our people, in our communities, it's so beautiful, right? And one meaning of brown is sort of referring to that cultural mixture. A second meaning of brown in the US context is the way in which we as Latinas and Latinos are positioned in between white and black, in terms of political discourse, in terms of churches and denominations, in terms of the economy, education, right? We're always kind of in between, and there's a long history of that in the United States. But we are in an experience of racial liminality, right? To use kind of like a fancy term, racial liminality. And from that place of liminality, we have been church. I want to share a poem that I think kind of encapsulates this history in broad strokes. And after that, I'm going to give some more specific examples of the brown church and brown theology. This poem, I should say, is inspired by the famous Chicano movement poem called I Am Joaquin. It's a very famous poem, I Am Joaquin, which was produced in the late 1960s, which articulated the new Chicano social identity of its time. In the 1950s and 60s, pretty much the accepted mode of social mobility for most Latinos was just assimilation, right? kind of assimilate into whiteness, get your education, become middle class. And the Chicana movement arose to say, no, we want to offer a different perspective. We are aware of systemic and historical racism vis-a-vis the Mexican-American community. We don't want to just assimilate into whiteness. We want to embrace all of our cultural heritage, including our indigenous background. We want to be proud of that. And we want to commit ourselves to a life of activism. And that, what I just shared there, became a new identity that people embrace powerfully to the present day, the identity of Chicano, Chicana. And this poem is inspired by the subject, the tone, the structure of the I Am Joaquin poem. And it's also, it's an attempt to frame, if you will, a brown Christian identity. So I'd like to share this. And this is in the book. I am the brown church. God calls me mija, mijo. Brown, black, white, even yellow are all within me. When black and white come to talk, my voice is not heard. I am not invited to the table. I share much with my black sisters and brothers, yet my voice is distinct. I long, I cry out to be heard for who I am, the brown church. Yo soy Montesinos gritando in 1511, the conquest is opposed to Christ. Y Bartolomé de las Casas, whose eyes like Moses were open to the suffering of his people and never looked back. Yo soy Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. My heart burns for the treasures of wisdom which are hidden in Christ. Though machismo assails me, aunque está bloqueado el camino, I do not relent. Yo soy Catarina de San Juan, la China poblana, stolen from Asia, enslaved by Spanish masters. I find freedom as the bride of Christ. I too hold the keys of the kingdom. Yo soy Padre Antonio Martínez de Nuevo Mexico. Aunque robaron a Aztlán, I know no nation holds a manifest destiny to decimate the people of another, also beloved of God. In the time of Jim Crow, they called me wetback, beaner, spick, and sent me to Mexican schools. Yet I am Mendez, Bernal, Perales, Calleros. My children are not cows, you cannot place them in a barn. My children are not animals, you cannot keep them in a cage. Yo soy Mamaleo y Santos Elizondo, mujeres forged in tongues of fire. Nadie me detendrá, porque el Espíritu del Señor está sobre mí. I am Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. I was raised in the bosom of Abuelita Theology and know that the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of God. Unos años después, mis primos huyeron la tierra madre, the land of the Savior, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Centroamérica, Argentina, Perú, Bolivia, Brasil, y al resto de Sudamérica. Empujada por el huracán de violencia, guerrillas, Reagan, priests all vied for me, yet on Christ my eyes were fixed. I am Gutierrez, Boff y Romero, y yo sé que el reino de Dios trae liberación y que el Espíritu nos libera. Como protestantes, we also protested porque la ropa anglosajón strangled la buena nueva. Soy Padilla y Escobar, recobrando la misión integral del Señor. Yo soy los dos alas del mismo pájaro, puertorriqueño, nuyorican, cubano y dominicano también. Though the colonizers have changed, the cries of Las Casas still ring strong in my ears. I am a dreamer, indocumentado, sin papeles. No human being is illegal. Jesús es mi refugio. I am a child of God. I now seek my voice, thus of God my own. I also am among the 12. God calls me mija, mijo. I am the brown church. And so this poem, I share this in this context to articulate this social identity that I'm bringing together in the book and this history of justice in Latin America and in the US Latino community from a religious perspective, an ecumenical perspective. And as we are at a state institution, I'm not saying any of this to try to convert anybody, just to be clear. I want to share some examples of the brown church and some brown theology as well. To give an example, what do I mean when I'm talking about this? Let's put some flesh on the bones here. And the quintessential example of the brown church is Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and their work in the farmworkers movement. My own department is called the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano Studies and Central American Studies. But even in our department, the faith that animated Chavez is rarely discussed. Chavez, for example, once said, "Today, I don't think I could base my will to struggle on cold economics or on some political doctrine. I don't think there would be enough to sustain me. For me, the base must be faith." While most people drawn towards liberalism or radicalism leave the church, I went the other way. I drew closer to the church the more I learned and understood. So it's really fascinating. It's kind of like, wow, it's kind of like the faith of Chavez has been scrubbed, right? Even though it played a central role in the farm workers movement. To give some examples of this, for example, there was a famous march, right, from Delano to Sacramento that took place in spring of 1966. Well, many people don't realize that it was actually fashioned after a Mexican-American pilgrimage. And it was actually called Penitence, Pilgrimage, and Revolution. Super fascinating, right? And the march took place during Lent, and they arrived on the steps of the Capitol of Sacramento on Easter morning and celebrated Mass off the back of a farm workers pickup truck with the farm workers altar. So powerful, right? So powerful. And this is what Chavez said about the pilgrimage. He said, "The penitential procession is also in the blood of the Mexican American, and the Delano March will therefore be one of penance, public penance for the sins of the strikers, their own personal sins, as well as the yielding perhaps to feelings of hatred and revenge in the strike itself. They hope by the march to set themselves at peace with the Lord so that the justice of their cause will be purified of all lesser motivation." Another example is Chavez's famous fasts, right? One of his fasts was actually 25 days long. And the farm worker movement was like at this impasse. They were not making progress. And then Chavez said, "You know what? I'm going to fast." People thought he was crazy. People were like, "What are you doing? We need action," and so forth. And Chavez said, "Wait a minute, I'm going to fast." Right? And he did fasting also as a way of re-emphasizing the nonviolent approach of the farm workers movement. And this is a quote that Chavez stated. And this is a picture with Robert Kennedy, right, and his wife. Chavez said, "I pray to God that this fast will be a preparation for a multiple of simple deeds of justice carried out by men and women whose hearts are focused on the suffering of the poor and who yearn with us for a better world." Nonviolence, right? So Chavez explicitly, drawing from Gandhi, the teachings of Jesus, and others, Chavez employed the approach of nonviolence. It's important to kind of clarify what he meant by that. So for Chavez, nonviolence was not the same as passivity, but involved the employment of peaceful, strategic methods such as boycotts, strikes, pilgrimages, prayer, and fasting. And Chavez said, people equate nonviolence with inaction, with not doing anything, and it's not that at all. It's exactly the opposite. Chavez referred to this approach as militant nonviolence and Gandhian moral jujitsu. So again, further sort of roots of the Brown Church in these spiritual principles and practices. Before we get to questions and conversation, I'd love to give some examples of Brown theology. And again, this 500-year tradition of Latino social justice reflection, right, from a theological perspective. And there is such a wide range of this. We could talk for days and days. In the book Brown Church, I provide an introduction to these different streams of Brown theology over the centuries. And my goal in Brown Church is really to just say, hey, this is a whole new area of academic exploration. I'm not the first one to research this, but I'm saying here's an introduction, and now go down the rabbit trail, right? But you have people, again, Brown theology from the colonial period, from Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Antonio de Montesinos, Bartolomé de las Casas, liberation theology in Latin America, Catholic liberation theology, Misión Integral, which is basically Protestant liberation theology, US-based Latino theology as opposed to Latin America, Mujerista theology, Latina Evangelica theology, Pentecostal liberation theology. So if you like theology, you can study this for a long time, right? And you'll never run out. It's important, like one key principle in Latino theology is called Theología en Conjunto. Theología en Conjunto, like communal reflection on theology. So for brown theologians, we don't just do theology for the sake of academic acclaim or just for our own selves. We do it in reflection as a community for the benefit of the community. And the way that Theología en Conjunto came about in the United States was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you had just very few US-based Latina theologians, right? And you had very few Roman Catholic and very few Protestant theologians. They were all exploring kind of the same kind of issues. So they'd get together and they would just share their papers. They would write about different theological sort of ideas. They'd share their papers. They would comment on each other's papers. And that's how US Latino theology developed, like as necessarily an ecumenical movement, because there are too few of us. There's still very too few of us. So it's always been that approach, that communal approach. One example of Latino theology in the United States is this idea of the Galilee principle. So if you're on this call and you're kind of familiar with the gospel writings, you'll remember that it says in many places that Jesus was from Galilee. Jesus was from this place called Galilee. It says it over and over again. Jesus was from Galilee. He was raised in Galilee. Most of the historic ministry of Jesus was in Galilee. He recruited his early leaders, the apostles and disciples, from Galilee. And from the faith perspective, faith tradition, when Jesus rose again, he told his disciples, "Meet me in Galilee." Right? So Galilee is like all over the place, right? And Latino theologians reflected upon what is the significance of Galilee, And basically what they found is that Galilee was the hood. Galilee was the hood of Jesus's day, right? Galilee was this borderlands region in the northern part of the Jewish community that was colonized by the Romans, that was looked down upon by the people from the big city in Jerusalem, their own people looked down upon them. All the power of the economy and religion and politics was in Jerusalem, and Galilee was like the boonies, if you will, right? Galileans spoke with an accent. They spoke non-standard Aramaic, if you will, right? They were multilingual. They spoke Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek to survive. And Jesus was from Nazareth, right? And Nazareth was like the hood of the hood. Galilee was the hood, and Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee, right? And so what Latino theologians say is that, again, according to Christian belief, Jesus, Son of God, incarnate, right, came intentionally as a Galilean, as a marginalized person, in other words, so that Jesus was brown, if you will, right? Not just literally, although he probably was literally brown, but he was brown in the sense of being this marginalized person in between all of these cultures and communities. Right? And for Latino theologians, that represents this principle, the Galilee principle, that those that human beings reject, God calls God's very own. And there are theologians by the name of Virgilio Elizondo, who was Mexican-American from Texas, Orlando Costas, who's Puerto Riqueño, who also reflected upon this idea. You have Mujerista theology or womanist theology as well. One core principle from Latin American liberation theology came out of Latin America, right, in the context of the revolutions of the 1960s and 70s. And one core principle of liberation theology in Latin America is this idea of the preferential option for the poor, which states that God cares and loves about everybody equally, but God has a unique care and concern for those who are poor and marginalized. Right? It's like I have children. Like I love both my kids equally, but if one of my kids is beating up on the other kid, in that moment I have unique concern for the kid that's getting beat up, right? And I have a moral obligation to intervene, right, in that conflict. Mujerista theology came out of the Roman Catholic tradition from mujeres, for women, who said, yeah, God also has a preferential option for women, because in this broken and fallen world, this patriarchal world, it's women that get the short end of the stick. So there is unique care and concern for women. Finally, one last example, lo cotidiano as a source of epistemology. So in the traditional academy, right, knowledge is something that you get only when you go to the university, and only when you get a graduate degree and a PhD, right? Knowledge is a very limited sort of, it's from the books, right? It's from these certain accepted authors. Lo cotidiano, which comes from Mujerista theology, says, that the daily lived experiences of our moms and abuelitas and our tias, when they do that hard work every day and they go to work on the bus and they sacrifice themselves and they make it so that we can survive, right? That knowledge is just as valuable as something learned in the books. Right? And maybe it's even more valuable because it's actually lived out, right? It has results, right? And so lo cotidiano, this notion, this theological notion from Latino theology, it dignifies the experience of our families, right? So again, examples of Brown theology and in the Brown Church. And finally, I'll close, and I look forward to having conversation here. Brown Church as social identity. So again, just as the Chicano social identity emerged uniquely out of the 60s, what I found is it's been crazy. I've given like about 50 talks over the last few months, as the book has come out, all across the country. And what I'm finding is that Brown Church is emerging as a social identity. Right? And so here's a quote from what someone wrote me, from Texas, actually. They said, "I cried all night. I finally found a home. What's amazing is that home has been there this whole time." So I kind of paused there, and thank you for listening to that long conversation. And I hope that we can now, just kind of get deeper into it and hear your thoughts, hear your questions, hear your critique, hear everything, and just enjoy this time of conversation together. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. Round of applause for Dr. Romero for that really good talk. We have time for 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. If anybody has any questions to ask, please raise your hand on the participants bar, and I will call on your name whoever I see first, if anybody has any questions.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy, but
and feel free to agree, disagree. It's totally fine. We want a safe space to be able to talk about these ideas.
I'll ask a question just to start off. Father Romero,
Sure.
Father, Dr. Romero, did you actually find any figures from the Orthodox faith within your study about Brown Church?
That is so interesting. So
it recently came up because recently we, in my church, we mentioned, in my Greek Orthodox church, we mentioned how there was a priest. His name was Father Andres Giron, and he was a senator also before he became a priest, and he had fought for the Mayan rights in Guatemala. So that's why I'm kind of asking for that.
Really, that's so fascinating. I mean, I didn't have the privilege of coming across his story, but I'm going to write it down. His name was Father Giron.
Andres Giron. Yeah,
that's amazing. Like in my survey of the literature, I did not come across him and other Orthodox parts of the Brown Church, but I'd love to explore that. As I mentioned before, I do have some significant roots in the Orthodox Church myself.
Yeah.
And one thing that I'll share, though, maybe this is my way of sort of bringing Brown theology into this, in terms of immigration. So, as I have tried to frame a theological understanding of immigration in the Bible, I've kind of reflected upon this idea of migration as grace. Migration is grace. That, like, when you see migration in the scriptures, it's typically like God intervenes in that process to express grace, to express God's love and compassion and care, right? And there's examples of, like, Joseph going to Egypt, right, as a forced migrant, but then becoming the hero, right, when there was a famine, right, and being able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and so forth. Migration is grace. Also, the Holy Family going to Egypt to escape death at the hands of Herod, right? But as I looked into Orthodox tradition, it's fascinating to find that, first of all, in Orthodox tradition, there is an altar there in a monastery in Egypt that was, according to tradition, one of the cradles of Jesus. That when Jesus and his family went as refugees to Egypt, that's where the baby Jesus slept. And it's the oldest altar, continuously used altar in the world, right? And it's a testament to hospitality, right? Biblical hospitality. There was apparently also another place in Egypt where the Holy Family went, and they were rejected, though. They were not allowed to stay. And according to Orthodox tradition, to this very day, 2,000 years later, bread will not rise. The bread will not rise in that part of Egypt, right? And according to Orthodox tradition, it's because they rejected Jesus and the Holy Family. They did not express hospitality. So anyways, thanks for listening to that.
Anybody else have any questions? Please don't be shy. If you need help, if you do not know how to raise your hand, you click on the participants bar, and then it should be right there on this. Should have a bar right there that allows you to click on raise hand with 3 dots at the end.
I see a question here, sorry, from Dolores, that was sent into the chat, but it may not be appearing for everybody. So Dolores, we can unmute you. And Dolores says that her video keeps cutting out, so that may be an issue. But she's asked here, she read a research study that correlates religiosity.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that.
Please go ahead.
Dolores?
Hi,
Hello?
sorry. My Zoom's acting a little funky. I loved your presentation, so thank you so much for that. Just the other day, I was reading a research study that correlates religiosity, or just being religious, especially like in Catholicism, with higher levels of depression and anxiety, and specifically in the Latinx community. Why do you think that may be?
Oh, wow. Like, not having read the study or I wouldn't really know how to speculate on that. Yeah, I really would probably need to know more information. But the broader point of being sort of correlation between anxiety and, in this, according to this study, participation in the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, I wouldn't know what to say, actually, to be honest. But I'd love to hear what you think, if you have a thought on that.
Dolores, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah. Well, my opinion, I didn't finish reading the study, but it's something that I have been talking a lot with both my partner and my families, and we think that it has a lot to do with like how the strict adherence to some Roman Catholicist views can influence like our culture, and how it for example, like there are some views on sexuality and how that might make and gender roles as well, and how that might make like progressive thinking regress. So that was just kind of like my opinions and how regressing that progressive thinking and not being able to advance in cultures and thinking like women are able to, I don't know, it's like a completely different, like stray in different direction, but how it just like the strict adherence in being religious and not being able to um like have sex before marriage or being able to be part of like the LGBTQ community, and how those stresses to not be yourself because you have to adhere to like these religious views can, I guess, make someone depressed or make someone anxious because they can't live to those views that are so cemented in the Latinx culture. So that was just my opinion. I'm not sure if that made sense, but that's just kind of what I was thinking.
Thank you. Thank you, Dolores. I'll have to look up that study.
Yeah. So our next question is from King To Young. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. If I didn't, forgive me. There.
Hello, King To Young from Sociology Department. I really enjoy your talk. Amazing. I
Thank
have
you.
a kind of question of whether not you have some comment on the emergence or the rise of evangelical movements in Latin America in the past, 1 or 2 decades. There are certain kind of and especially when you're thinking about the brown church, the sources of theological sources coming from the liberal theology came from sort of more the Catholic side, right, versus the Protestant side, evangelicalism. So I wonder whether or not you have some comments on that sort of two sources, of theological developments, and also the understanding of social justice, because sometimes the evangelical movements from Latin America tend to be aligned with more the right side of the political spectrum. So I wonder whether or not you have some comments. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Young. Sure. And there's an expression that liberation theology opted for the poor, and then the poor opted for Pentecostalism. Yeah, I think that I was having a conversation with a friend about this yesterday. I think that I was talking, like a friend of mine is like part of the family that developed this framework of what's called Misión Integral in Latin America. It was an evangelical kind of framework. Latin American evangelical, again, to be distinguished from US evangelicalism, but evangelical framework that said that holistic biblical mission is it's like two wings of a plane. It has to involve the personal transformation and the social transformation. Right? It's sort of like it's a verbal proclamation of Christianity and the embodiment in justice and loving your neighbor. And one of the things that my friend said was, that's really hard to do. It's really easier to do one wing or the other. It's really hard to do both. And that's one reason why this Misión Integral, which could be loosely called Protestant liberation theology, but that's not quite accurate, why it didn't sort of take on deep roots in Latin America. Another friend I was talking to last night was telling me that the notion of Misión Integral, again, this Protestant version of sort of justice Christianity in Latin America, it was concentrated in higher levels of academic thinking, and it never made it deep into the roots of society. So it's had an impact, but never went down deep. And then contrast that with my friend was saying, and my friend that I was talking to last night is like a church planter all throughout Latin America and in the United States, but he's Dominican. He said that versus some of the other strains of, let's say, like the prosperity gospel. That the language of the prosperity gospel had the mechanisms and the social connections and outlets, really made its way deep quickly because it made it into the grassroots. And I think that that's part of it. And one more thing I'll say is, I think, like, when I talk with young adults, Latino young adults in the United States, and their family members come, let's say, from Central America, there's so much trauma associated with the civil wars and associated with social justice. So basically, like, if someone says social justice and they're from Central America and they experience the civil wars, it triggers a lot of trauma, because just, it's kind of trendy in the US to say, oh, I care about justice. But over there, if you said I care about justice, you would die. And so I think that that's another barrier, like in the United States. And I'm very sympathetic to that as well. So thank you. That's a great question. I'm sure there's a lot of other reasons too, but that would be my first shot at it.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Young. Dr. Murray said that there was 3 questions that were sent to him privately. If you would like to ask them, Professor, and
Yes,
state
just
where they came from.
a couple comments, and they were related to Dolores's question. So a couple questions back,
Yeah.
and that is just in reference to that from Mayo Toruno. There's a distinction between USA versions of Catholicism and Latin American versions of Catholicism. This might be part of the context of that question, so more of a comment. And then from David Chavez, it's always important to see the specifics of the study to determine whether there are validity to the findings, but it may also be that we assume that religiosity causes depression, but it may also be that having depression or other mental health issues get people to seek comfort. So those were sort of more comments on that. And then David Chavez followed up. Dolores has a good point. The study may have neglected to address the progressive, i.e. Brown church versus conservative church issue. And then David had to go to class. So he sent those to me. And then there was one more question, and that was whether there are forms of Christianity that are being used as a tool of colonialism today. So sort of in the more oppressive mode. And so I want to apologize for my sort of amateurish management of the Zoom, just in terms of getting these questions. But also, if anybody else has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand, and Nathan should be able to, Professor Romero, or I should be able to unmute you guys. But I'll leave it there, just with this question of whether, religion can also be used in this, this sort of two-edged sword.
Certainly. And I think that to kind of oversimplify it, the Brown Church has always existed in contrast to colonial Christianity. So probably over the last 500 years, probably 85% of Christianity has been colonial and horrible. But then the Brown Church is part of that 15% that has always pushed back. So to give an example of this, the Brown Church was born in 1511 when a Dominican priest, he was living in the islands, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and we just celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and that Columbus, when he kind of got lost and landed in the Americas, he landed in what is now the Caribbean, right? Puerto Rico, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and by 1511, hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples had died. So horrible, right? From slavery, from disease, from many types of abuse. And in 1511, this Dominican priest, it was the Sunday before Christmas in 1511, and he got up to preach before an audience of elite Spaniards from the island. And he said, listen carefully to what I'm about to say. He said, what I'm about to say will be the strangest word you've ever heard. I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. And then he preached the first social justice sermon, and some would say invented social justice in the Americas. And what he did was he said, Spaniards, God gave you the chance to share the love of God, and instead you exploited it for an opportunity for selfish gain. And if you don't repent, he basically said, God's going to send you to hell, right? It was 1511. It's important to note that date because that was before the Protestant-Catholic divide. And it was also the work of Montesinos and later Las Casas that really created this concept of social justice that we know it today, right? Had those religious roots. So to answer, and so anyways, to sort of reflect to the question, absolutely, there is this horrible history of colonialism and Christianity. But the Brown Church has always, I can give many examples. The book is 300 pages of examples of how, though the Brown Church has arisen to say, that's not true Christianity. That's something different. Yeah, and I guess I will say one thing back to the Galilee point. Like our images of Jesus are always as like this blonde surfer guy, right? The colonial Jesus. But again, as we've discussed, as Latino theologians have discussed, Jesus was an oppressed person, a marginalized brown man, right? Who lived under Roman colonialism. And those are the roots of the church, not the colonial roots, which got, I would say in my view, that usurped the original movement.
Any other questions from anybody? Last minute questions?
Sorry, Nathan, I just picked up another one here.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good. Perfect.
And if possible, I do want to pull rank and ask a question myself. But just from Jim Fenlon, a good technical question, because I'd actually like this one as well. Thanks for attending, Jim. Could you please give us the name and possibly a citation for the 1511 sermon?
Oh, sure. Well, it's in my book. It's well cited. Yeah, like, I'm sorry, I don't have it with me right here. I guess I could get the book if you want, but it's there. It's well documented. Yeah.
And the name of the
of that gentleman, his name was
yes.
Antonio de Montesinos.
Montesinos.
Antonio de Montesinos. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
And there's a whole literature on kind of this guy by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas and the religious protests to Spanish colonialism, and he's a very well-known figure. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Romero. I wanted to ask a little bit about the sort of current state of the Brown Church, especially in the conversation since May, related to the obviously this upheaval of cries for racial justice in the country. Do you see an alignment there starting to take shape, or that's been in place for decades or centuries, and just a little bit of a current status on the national conversation, the global conversation around that?
Sure, I see a mix. So I think that in the community organizing work that we've done over the last few years, what we've done is organize churches and Latino churches, Pentecostal churches and other churches, right, in immigration advocacy. So we had like a big case involving an Assemblies of God pastor, Pastor Noe Carillas. And I was so surprised that case, because it was so, like, a little background, Pastor Noe came to the US as a child refugee in the civil wars of Central America, married a US citizen, has 2 US citizen kids, became a pastor, and he was being deported. And that case is kind of like a Rosa Parks kind of moment, and really galvanized a lot of Latino churches that I had never seen galvanized before, right? A lot of Pentecostal churches, it galvanized people from throughout the country, pardon me, and even in Latin America. And so I think that the immigration, the anti-immigrant work or sentiment and laws and policies, part of my background is I'm an immigration lawyer as well, but it has galvanized a lot of people. At the same time, you have many Latinos who have sided with what you could say is sort of colonial perspectives, right? And I think there's multiple reasons for that. One of those reasons has to do with the fact that, like, even like the term brown, we've always been as Latinos in between black and white in US society. And there's always been some of us who, if we get enough education, enough money, we look a certain way, we can assimilate into whiteness and kind of just forget everybody else of our community, right? That's always been an option. We've always had that in our community. We have that today. That's a lot of what that still happens. people kind of opting to try to become part of power. Another thing is that many Latinos in the broader Latino church have inherited not just Christianity, but colonial ways of thinking and ideas. That's absolutely true, right? And those kinds of so they've inherited sort of a certain type of political identity, right, in the United States and in Latin America for that matter. And what I found though is that more people than ever are trying to disentangle those two, but it's certainly very real, really big reality. One more thing I'll say, like as an example of this, is there's confusion when a lot of times, like, or not confusion, but like in Latin America, right, there's a different type of separation of church and state and advocacy. And like, let's say someone is a pastor of a little church, or not, maybe even not so little church, 500-person church in a town in Guatemala, and the local mayor comes up and says, "Hey, pastor, I'll let you use the municipal building for your big rally next week, right? I'll let you use it for free for Christmas. It can seat 2,000 people." What do you say to that, right? You're a pastor. You're barely surviving, making ends meet, feeding your family. If you say no to that government official in Latin America, that'll cause you problems, right? If you say yes, and you get this building, right, for use, but then the politician is going to come around and say, "Hey, toma una foto, right? Toma una foto, right?" And use it for their political campaign. What are you going to do, right? And I think that that's also part of what happens, is that many pastors from Latin America, they've kind of had to play that game to survive, right? So if they get approached by a politician in the United States, there could be those kind of things happening too. So anyway, I think there's a lot of different layers of reasons for why that's happening. I mean, for me personally, it makes me really sad, right? When Latino churches support laws and policies that hurt our people. Right? I mean, to be sad, that doesn't just make me sad, it makes me just furious, actually. But that's been the history of the brown church. It's always been that way.
Thank you for that. Any other last minute questions?
I want to just echo some thanks that have been sent. And again, this is a failing on my managing of the Zoom session. For some reason, the efforts by some folks who have to drop out to send a chat to everybody, they just come into me. But I do have the session recorded. So if folks need to drop out early, I'll be able to share the recording. And I just want to, for Dr. Romero, I want to echo the thanks of many of my great colleagues who've attended, sending me really profuse thanks for this really enlightening and invigorating conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, and thank you to all the colleagues on the call. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you personally, but I hope that we can follow up, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, is there actually anywhere that they could contact you, Dr. Romero, if anybody wants to ask any more questions afterwards?
Yeah, so I can give my email. I can put it in the chat to everyone. I'll put my private one, Chao Romero @gmail.com. I do social media a lot, so I'm like all the stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. So I have a pretty active social media kind of thing. So I can keep it that way. Got a website.
And if anybody is interested in Dr. Romero's book, you can find it on Amazon, actually. So that's really good. I want to thank everybody for coming to this talk, and I appreciate everybody who asked questions. And I thank everybody for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Romero. Thank you, Nathan. Really wonderful job hosting, Nathan. And thank you so much, Dr. Romero, for making the time to join us.
Thank you. I look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
For attending.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sir, do you stop the recording or do I?